October 20, 1943. A basement apartment on Lekarska Street in the heart of occupied Warsaw. Irena Sendler sat at a small wooden table, carefully transcribing names onto tissue-thin cigarette paper by the light of a single candle. The names were coded, each one representing a Jewish child she had smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto and placed with Polish families willing to risk death to shelter them. She wrote in the tiniest script possible, preserving every detail: original name, new identity, current location, parents' names if known. Outside, German patrols moved through the darkened streets, their boots echoing off cobblestones still slick from afternoon rain. Inside, Irena's hand moved steadily across the fragile paper, documenting what had become the most dangerous database in Nazi-occupied Europe. She was 33 years old, a social worker employed by the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, and she was systematically dismantling the Nazis' carefully constructed system of genocide, one child at a time. The tissue papers would be sealed in glass jars and buried beneath an apple tree in a friend's garden. If she was caught, if the Gestapo came for her as they had come for so many others, these jars would be the only record that these children had ever existed, the only thread connecting them to families who were already vanishing into death camps. What Irena couldn't know, as she finished transcribing the 218th name that evening, was that her network had already saved more Jewish children than any single rescue operation in occupied Europe. She didn't think of herself as exceptional. She was simply doing what needed to be done, what anyone with a conscience would do when faced with the systematic murder of innocents. But history would remember it differently. This is the story of how a Polish social worker named Irena Sendler orchestrated the rescue of approximately 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto, how she endured torture rather than betray them, and how the world forgot her story for nearly 60 years. To understand what Irena accomplished, you first need to understand what Warsaw had become by the autumn of 1940. The city had surrendered to German forces on September 27, 1939, after 3 weeks of bombardment that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. The occupation that followed was methodical and merciless. German authorities immediately began implementing racial laws designed to isolate, impoverish, and ultimately exterminate Poland's Jewish population. Warsaw had been home to approximately 350,000 Jews before the war, making it the second largest Jewish community in the world after New York. They were doctors, teachers, merchants, artisans, intellectuals. They were neighbors. Many had lived in Warsaw for generations, their families woven into the city's cultural and economic fabric. In October 1940, the Germans ordered all Jewish residents to relocate to a designated district in the north of the city. The Warsaw Ghetto, as it came to be known, covered approximately 1.3 square miles. Into this space, the Nazis crammed nearly 400,000 people. 400,000 human beings compressed into an area that had previously housed 160,000. The ghetto was surrounded by an 11-foot brick wall topped with barbed wire and broken glass. Guards stood at each of the 22 gates, controlling all movement in and out. The conditions inside defied description. Families of 7 or 8 crowded into single rooms. Buildings lacked adequate sanitation, heat, or running water. The daily food ration provided by German authorities was calculated at approximately 200 calories per person. Starvation became systematic. By the summer of 1941, 5,000 people were dying each month from hunger, disease, and exposure. Children were everywhere in the ghetto, thousands of them, orphaned by disease, separated from parents conscripted for forced labor, or simply abandoned by families who could no longer feed them. They wandered the streets in rags, begging for bread, sleeping in doorways, dying on sidewalks. German guards watched them starve with bureaucratic indifference. This was the deliberate outcome of carefully calculated policies designed to make the ghetto unlivable. Polish citizens on the outside watched this horror unfold through the ghetto walls. They could see the tops of buildings beyond the barricades, could hear the sounds of the trapped population, sometimes could glimpse faces through gaps in the walls. Most looked away, terrified by German threats that anyone caught helping Jews would be executed along with their entire family. German occupation authorities had made the rules absolutely clear. Providing food to Jews, death. Sheltering Jews, death. Any form of assistance whatsoever, death. But Irena Sendler had decided that some things were worth dying for. She had been horrified by the ghetto from the moment it was established. Her father, a physician who had died when Irena was 7, had treated poor Jewish patients for free during typhus outbreaks, even when other doctors refused. He had contracted typhus himself from these patients and died from it. Before his death, he had told young Irena something she never forgot: if you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. Now, watching children starve behind ghetto walls, Irena remembered her father's words. She was a social worker employed by the Warsaw Department of Social Welfare, which gave her a certain amount of bureaucratic access. The Germans, obsessed with controlling disease, allowed some Polish social workers to enter the ghetto to monitor sanitary conditions and deliver supplies to orphanages. Irena applied for one of these permits. She was granted entry in October 1940. What she witnessed inside the ghetto shattered whatever remained of her innocence. The smell hit first, a mixture of human waste, rotting garbage, and decay that permeated everything. Then the sounds: children crying, the weak pleas of beggars, the hollow cough of typhus victims. Bodies lay in the streets, covered with newspapers, waiting for the morning collection. People shuffled past them without looking, too exhausted and numb to register yet another death. Irena visited orphanages and makeshift shelters, ostensibly to assess sanitary conditions and deliver what meager supplies the Warsaw Social Welfare Department could provide. But she was really documenting the situation, trying to understand the scale of the catastrophe, searching for any way to help. The children affected her most deeply. Toddlers with distended bellies from malnutrition, infants too weak to cry, older children with eyes that had seen too much. They were dying by the hundreds, and nobody outside the walls seemed to care. She couldn't save them all. The thought was crushing. But maybe, if she was clever, if she was brave, if she built the right network of accomplices, she could save some. A dozen children. Maybe 24. Every life saved would be a small victory against the vast machinery of death. Irena began carefully, selecting a few trusted colleagues who might be willing to help. She approached Irena Schultz first, a fellow social worker who had Jewish family members trapped in the ghetto. Then Jadwiga Piotrowska, a nurse who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Irena. One by one, she built a core group of accomplices, women mostly, all of them aware that what they were planning would get them killed if they were caught. The method had to be simple. German bureaucracy was obsessive about documentation, but it was also massive and inefficient. Polish social workers could enter the ghetto with permits. They could bring supplies in. They could, theoretically, bring other things out. The first child Irena smuggled out was a 6-year-old girl named Elżbieta, in December 1940. Elżbieta had been living in a ghetto orphanage, her parents having died from typhus within weeks of each other. Irena visited the orphanage, posing as a sanitation inspector. She told the orphanage director, a man she had known before the war, what she was planning. He stared at her for a long moment, processing the insanity of what she was proposing. Then he simply nodded and fetched the girl. Irena wrapped Elżbieta in a blanket and placed her in a large tool bag used for carrying supplies. She gave the child a sedative, enough to make her drowsy but not unconscious. She needed the girl to be quiet, but she also needed her able to respond if something went wrong. At the ghetto gate, Irena presented her exit permit to the guard. He glanced at her papers, glanced at the bag, then waved her through. Just like that. The entire operation had taken less than 2 minutes. Outside the ghetto, Irena unwrapped Elżbieta in an apartment she had prepared in advance. The girl was terrified, confused, desperate for her parents. Irena held her and lied. She told her that her parents had sent her away to be safe, that they would come for her when the war ended. The lie felt like poison, but it was necessary. These children needed hope, even false hope, to survive what was coming. Irena had already arranged a placement with a Polish family in the suburbs, a couple named the Kowalskis who had agreed to take the child despite the death penalty for doing so. She changed Elżbieta's name to Janina, gave her a false identity card prepared by underground forgers, and delivered her to her new home. Then Irena returned to the ghetto and began planning the next rescue. By early 1941, Irena had smuggled out 7 children using variations on this method. She hid them in toolboxes, supply crates, coffins marked as containing typhus victims, even in the back of the ambulance that transported corpses and disease victims out of the ghetto. Each escape required perfect timing, nerves of steel, and enough sedative to keep small children quiet without killing them. The margin for error was 0. If a child cried out at the wrong moment, if a German guard decided to inspect a particular bag, if a document looked suspicious, everyone involved would be shot. The operation expanded as word spread through the underground resistance network. More social workers volunteered to help. More Polish families agreed to shelter children. More forgers joined the network, creating false birth certificates and baptismal records that could transform Jewish children into Catholic Poles. Irena became the center of this expanding web, the one person who knew all the pieces, who kept track of which children went where, who maintained the master list. She developed a coded system for her records. Each child was assigned a number. Their real Jewish name, new Catholic identity, and current location were recorded on tissue paper using abbreviated codes only Irena could decipher. The papers were stored in glass jars that were then buried in gardens across Warsaw. If the network was compromised, if Irena was arrested, these buried jars would be the only way to reunite children with surviving family members after the war. The logistics were staggering. Each rescue required multiple accomplices, someone to identify children in the ghetto, someone to prepare false documents, someone to smuggle them out, someone to provide temporary shelter, someone to arrange permanent placement with Polish families. Every step involved risk, and every person in the chain could be tortured into revealing others if caught. Irena carefully compartmentalized information, ensuring that most operatives only knew their small piece of the operation. By the summer of 1942, Irena's network was rescuing children at an unprecedented rate. She had recruited additional smugglers, including a plumber who had access to the Warsaw sewer system. Children as young as 3 were led through the filthy, rat-infested tunnels beneath the ghetto wall, emerging in basements on the Aryan side. Older children were coached to act sick and placed in ambulances alongside actual disease patients. Babies were drugged and hidden in supply crates marked with red crosses, betting that German guards wouldn't inspect medical supplies too carefully. The youngest children, those too young to remember, were the easiest to place. Polish families could pass them off as orphaned relatives, and the children would grow up never knowing they were Jewish. But older children, those with memories of parents and siblings, required more careful handling. They had to be taught their new Catholic identities, had to memorize prayers they didn't understand, had to learn to suppress their Jewish heritage completely. It was a kind of violence, this erasure of identity, but it was violence in service of survival. Irena met with each child before they were smuggled out, when possible. She tried to memorize their faces, the shape of their eyes, the sound of their voices. She wanted them to know that someone cared, that someone would remember them even if they forgot themselves. She told them they were brave. She told them their parents loved them. She didn't tell them that most of their parents were already dead or would be soon. The summer of 1942 brought horror on a scale that exceeded even the ghetto's previous suffering. In July, the Germans began mass deportations to Treblinka extermination camp. 6,000 people per day were herded into cattle cars and shipped to their deaths. The ghetto population dropped from nearly 400,000 to fewer than 60,000 in just 2 months. Entire families vanished. Streets that had been crowded with desperate humanity became silent, empty, haunted. Irena's rescue operations became more urgent and more dangerous. Parents who had initially refused to give up their children now begged her to take them. Mothers thrust babies into her arms, knowing they would never see them again but desperate to give them any chance at survival. The selections happened with brutal randomness. Children found hiding were shot on sight. Anyone too sick, too old, or too young to work was sent to the trains. The physical methods of smuggling children adapted to the changing conditions. With fewer people moving in and out of the ghetto, Irena had to be more creative. She worked with sympathetic German guards, bribing them with black market goods and money provided by the Polish underground. One guard, a man whose name Irena never learned, looked the other way while children were hidden in ambulances that he was supposed to search. Why did he help? Perhaps he had children of his own. Perhaps he was simply capable of mercy. He disappeared in late 1942, likely executed for some other act of compassion. By October 1943, Irena's network had smuggled approximately 2,500 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Each rescue had required dozens of people risking their lives. Each child represented a family destroyed, parents murdered, a small life salvaged from the ruins. The glass jars buried in gardens across Warsaw now contain the names and locations of hundreds of children scattered throughout occupied Poland. The Gestapo had been watching Irena for months. They knew someone was smuggling Jewish children out of the ghetto, but the operation was too well compartmentalized to trace back to a single source. Irena varied her routines, never used the same route twice in succession, constantly changed her methods of communication. But the Germans were patient, methodical, and ultimately relentless. On October 20, 1943, the same day Irena had been transcribing names by candlelight, Gestapo officers surrounded her apartment building. They came at dawn, the preferred time for arrests because people are most disoriented when woken suddenly. 11 armed men for one Polish social worker. The Germans took no chances with resistance operatives. They burst through her door with guns drawn, screaming commands in German. Irena had been expecting this moment for months. She had prepared for it, rehearsed it in her mind. She showed no fear, no surprise. She simply stood and faced them with a calm that unnerved her interrogators. They searched her apartment, looking for the list of names, the documentation that would reveal the entire network. They found nothing. Irena had moved the most recent records just 2 days earlier, burying them in yet another garden. The few papers remaining in her apartment were innocuous social welfare documents that revealed nothing. The Gestapo officers, frustrated by the lack of evidence, arrested her anyway. They would extract the information they needed through other means. She was taken to WWII prison, the infamous facility where the Germans interrogated suspected resistance members. The building was Gothic, medieval in appearance, its thick stone walls soundproofed to muffle screams. Irena was thrown into a cell with 10 other women, given no food, and left to contemplate what was coming. The interrogations began the next morning. Gestapo officers asked her questions she could not answer without betraying the children. Who helped you? Where are the children hidden? Who provided false documents? How did you communicate with the Jewish underground? Irena said nothing. Her silence was absolute, infuriating her torturers with its completeness. They beat her systematically, using methods designed to cause maximum pain without killing. They broke both her legs with iron bars, shattering bones in multiple places. They broke her feet, ensuring she would never walk normally again. They used electric shocks, water torture, psychological manipulation. Between torture sessions, they locked her in solitary confinement, a tiny cell with no light, no sound, nothing but her pain and her determination not to break. Days blurred into weeks. The torture continued, relentless, professional. The Gestapo interrogators were experts at breaking people, at finding the psychological weakness that could be exploited. But Irena possessed something they couldn't understand, a moral clarity so absolute that no amount of physical pain could shake it. She had promised those children they would be safe. She had promised their dying parents. She would die before breaking that promise. In her cell, Irena prepared herself for execution. She knew the pattern. The Gestapo tortured prisoners until they broke or until they concluded that the prisoner would never break. Then they killed them. She had seen it happen to others. She expected the same fate. But something unexpected happened. The Polish underground resistance movement had learned of Irena's arrest. They understood that if she broke, if she revealed the network, hundreds of children would be rounded up and murdered. The entire rescue operation would collapse. They also understood that Irena would never willingly betray the children, which meant the Gestapo would eventually execute her. Zgoda, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, made a decision. They would attempt to bribe Irena's guards and arrange her escape. It was an insane plan, extraordinarily risky, but they had no choice. Zgoda made contact with a German guard at WWII prison who had accepted bribes in the past. They offered him a fortune in black market currency to help Irena escape. The guard agreed. On the morning of February 20, 1944, 4 months after her arrest, Irena was told she was being transferred to another facility for further interrogation. Instead, the guard led her to a side exit. Outside, resistance operatives were waiting with a car. They drove her to a safe house where a doctor set her broken bones as best he could without proper equipment. Irena had escaped, but she was not safe. The Gestapo had officially listed her as executed, a bureaucratic sleight of hand arranged by the bribed guard. As far as German records were concerned, Irena Sendler had been shot on February 20, 1944. This gave her a kind of protection. She was already dead in the files, which meant the Germans weren't actively hunting her. But she had to remain hidden, using false identity papers, never staying in one place too long. Her legs had been so badly damaged that she could barely walk. The bones had been shattered, then poorly set without proper medical care. She would limp for the rest of her life, constant pain a reminder of those months in Pauillac prison. But she was alive, and the children were still hidden, their locations still secret. The Warsaw Uprising began in August 1944, a desperate attempt by the Polish resistance to liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived. It failed catastrophically. The Germans systematically destroyed Warsaw in retaliation, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Irena, still in hiding, listened to her city die. The uprising lasted 63 days before the resistance surrendered. German forces then spent months demolishing what remained of Warsaw, burning entire districts, executing civilians, erasing the city from existence. The glass jars containing the children's records survived. The gardens where they were buried were destroyed, but the jars themselves remained intact beneath the rubble. Irena had buried them deep enough that German demolition crews never found them. When Soviet forces finally liberated Warsaw in January 1945, the city was gone. Approximately 85% of the buildings had been destroyed. The population had been reduced from 1.3 million to fewer than 200,000 survivors. Irena emerged from hiding into a city that no longer existed. The Warsaw she had known, the neighborhoods where she had grown up, the streets where she had lived and worked and smuggled children to safety, all of it was gone. Nothing remained but ruins and memories. She began the painful work of recovering the buried jars and attempting to reunite the rescued children with surviving family members. She excavated the first jar in March 1945, digging through frozen ground with her bare hands, her damaged legs screaming with pain. Inside were dozens of tissue-thin papers, each one coded with a child's location. She unburied 4 more jars over the following weeks, recovering the complete record of approximately 2,500 children. Then she began the heartbreaking process of tracking them down. Most of the children had no surviving family members. Their parents had died in the ghetto, been murdered at Treblinka, or been killed during the uprising. These children, now scattered across Poland with Polish families, would never return to their Jewish identities. They had become Catholic Poles, and many wanted to remain that way. The trauma of the war had been so complete that they couldn't process their true heritage. Some children rejected Irena when she found them. They had forgotten their Jewish names, forgotten their parents' faces, built new identities that felt real and safe. Forcing them to confront their past felt cruel, but Irena believed they deserved to know. She visited each child when possible, showing them the records, telling them their real names, giving them the choice to reclaim their heritage or continue living as Poles. Perhaps 10% of the children were reunited with surviving family members. A father who had somehow survived Auschwitz. An aunt who had hidden in a monastery. Grandparents who had fled to the Soviet Union. These reunions were simultaneously joyful and devastating. The children didn't recognize these strangers who claimed to be family. Years had passed. They had been so young. The memories were gone. Irena kept detailed records of all the children's fates, documenting which ones were reunited with family, which ones remained with their Polish foster families, which ones eventually emigrated to Israel or America. She maintained this documentation for the rest of her life, believing that history needed to remember these children, needed to know their names and stories. Poland after the war was a complicated place. The country had suffered proportionally more than any other nation during World War II, losing approximately 17% of its population. The Holocaust had effectively erased Polish Jewry, reducing a community of 3.5 million to fewer than 300,000 survivors. Soviet occupation brought a different kind of oppression, a communist regime that viewed resistance heroes with suspicion. Irena continued working as a social worker under the communist government, but she said nothing about her wartime activities. The communist authorities discouraged discussion of the Holocaust, preferring narratives that emphasized Polish suffering under German occupation. Jewish rescue stories complicated this narrative, suggesting that some Poles had collaborated with occupiers while others had risked everything to save Jews. It was easier to forget. For decades, Irena Sendler lived in obscurity. She worked her administrative job, raised her daughter, dealt with chronic pain from her broken legs, and said nothing about the 2,500 children. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as someone who had done what needed to be done, what any decent person would have done. The fact that so few others had helped made her story exceptional, but she never framed it that way. In 1965, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, recognized Irena as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. She traveled to Israel to plant a tree in the Garden of the Righteous, standing alongside others who had performed similar acts of rescue. But even this honor didn't bring wider recognition. The ceremony was small, attended mostly by survivors. The world at large still knew nothing of what she had accomplished. Poland's communist government was suspicious of her recognition from Israel. Official policy discouraged emphasis on Jewish suffering or Polish rescue efforts. Irena learned to stay quiet about her past, to deflect questions, to avoid drawing attention. She lived this way for another 30 years, anonymous, her story untold. Then, in 1999, something unexpected happened. For high school students in a small Kansas town were working on a National History Day project about the Holocaust. They discovered a brief reference to Irena Sendler in an old magazine article, which mentioned she had helped save Jewish children in Warsaw. The number quoted was 2,500 children. The students thought it was a typo. Surely it meant 250 children. Saving 2,500 would have been impossible. They researched further and discovered the number was correct. They also discovered that Irena was still alive, living in a nursing home in Warsaw at age 89. The students wrote a play about her story, performed it at their school, and began a campaign to make her story known. Their play, Life in a Jar, became a phenomenon, performed hundreds of times across America and Europe. Suddenly, after 60 years of obscurity, the world wanted to know about Irena Sendler. Journalists interviewed her. Documentary filmmakers came to Warsaw. Holocaust survivors who had been among the rescued children contacted her, thanking her for saving their lives. The Polish government, now post-communist, recognized her contributions with national honors. Irena was bewildered by the attention. She was nearly 90 years old, in constant pain, living in a modest nursing home room. She didn't understand why people cared so much about things she had done 6 decades earlier. When journalists called her a hero, she would shake her head and insist she had only done what was right. She spoke not of courage but of moral obligation, not of rescuing children but of witnessing horror and being unable to look away. In 2003, the Polish government awarded her the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest civilian honor. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, ultimately losing to Al Gore. The irony was not lost on observers. A woman who had saved 2,500 lives received less recognition than a politician who had made a documentary about climate change. But Irena was gracious about it. She had never sought recognition. She had simply done what needed to be done. She died on May 12, 2008, at age 98. Her funeral was attended by government officials, Holocaust survivors, and several of the children she had saved, now elderly themselves. They spoke of her courage, her compassion, her absolute refusal to compromise her principles even under torture. They spoke of how she had given them life twice, once by smuggling them out of the ghetto, and again by preserving the records that allowed them to reclaim their identities. The jars she had buried in Warsaw gardens are now preserved in museums. The tissue-thin papers, with their coded lists of names, serve as physical evidence of what one person can accomplish in the face of systematic evil. Historians have verified the rescue of approximately 2,500 Jewish children, making Irena's network the largest single rescue operation of children during the Holocaust. But numbers don't capture what she really accomplished. Each of those 2,500 children represented a family destroyed, parents who had handed over their children knowing they would never see them again. Each rescue required dozens of accomplices willing to risk execution. Each name in those jars represented someone who would have died if Irena had been less brave, less organized, less absolutely committed to doing what was right regardless of the cost. She always said the same thing when people praised her: "I could have done more." Even after saving 2,500 children, she felt she had failed because she couldn't save them all. This was the moral framework she lived within, a framework that accepted no compromise, no excuse, no consolation in partial victories. Every child left behind haunted her. Every name she couldn't fit in the jar, every face she couldn't remember, every small life snuffed out while she was saving others. The children she saved went on to live full lives. They became doctors, teachers, artists, parents, grandparents. They scattered across the world: Israel, America, Poland, dozens of other countries. Many didn't discover their Jewish heritage until they were adults, confronting their true identities decades after Irena had hidden them. Some embraced their heritage, reclaiming the names she had recorded. Others chose to remain who they had become, unwilling to reopen wounds that had finally healed. Their children and grandchildren number in the thousands now. Entire family trees that wouldn't exist if Irena Sendler hadn't been willing to die rather than betray the children in her care. Weddings and births and graduations, the ordinary miracles of human life, all made possible by tissue paper in glass jars buried in Warsaw gardens. Near the end of her life, Irena was asked what she wanted people to remember about her story. She thought for a moment, then said, "I want people to understand that you don't have to be extraordinary to do extraordinary things. You just have to care. You have to care enough to act when acting is dangerous. You have to care enough to risk everything when others have already lost everything." She paused, her eyes distant, perhaps seeing again the faces of children she had saved, or the faces of those she couldn't save. "Every child was the world," she said quietly. "When you save a child, you save the world. I wish I could have saved more worlds." The apple tree beneath which she buried the first jar still stands in what is now central Warsaw. The city has been rebuilt, rising from the ruins the Germans left behind. Modern buildings occupy spaces where ghetto walls once stood. The streets are clean, prosperous, filled with people who have no memory of what happened here. But the tree remains, older now, weathered, its roots running deep through soil that once held glass jars containing the most precious information in occupied Europe. Sometimes, on quiet evenings in Warsaw, elderly people stop near that tree. They might be former resistance members, or Holocaust survivors, or simply Poles who remember the war. They stand silently, looking at the tree, thinking about what was buried there and what it represented. The courage it took. The network it required. The absolute commitment to decency in a world that had gone insane with hate. Irena Sendler's story isn't really about one remarkable woman, though she was remarkable. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept evil as inevitable. It's about the networks of courage that form when individuals decide that some things are worth dying for. It's about 2,500 worlds saved, one, by a social worker who believed that if you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. The tissue papers are preserved now in climate-controlled archives. The names are readable, the codes deciphered, the children's fates documented for history. But what can't be preserved, what can only be imagined, is what it felt like for Irena to write those names by candlelight, knowing that German patrols were outside, knowing that every name she recorded represented a child she had promised to protect. Knowing that if she was caught, everyone would die. She kept writing anyway. That's the essence of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the commitment to act despite fear, to continue doing what's right when every rational calculation suggests you should stop. To care about 2,500 individual worlds when the machinery of genocide was consuming millions. To preserve names when the entire apparatus of Nazi Germany was designed to erase those names from history. Warsaw rebuilt itself from ruins. The ghetto walls were torn down. New buildings rose where the old ones had stood. Life continued, as it always does, because humans are resilient and the future demands attention. But beneath the rebuilt city, in the soil where glass jars once lay hidden, the memory remains. The memory of what was lost, what was saved, and what one woman accomplished when she refused to accept that some children were meant to die. Irena Sendler saved the world 2,500 times. And then, for 60 years, the world forgot what she had done. The forgetting might be the most painful part of her story. Not just that she endured torture rather than betray the children, but that the world she saved them for didn't recognize the gift until she was nearly dead herself. Recognition came in the end, but it came too late for her to fully appreciate it, too late for most of the world to thank her properly, too late to save her from the decades of anonymity when she might have benefited from knowing her sacrifice was acknowledged. But perhaps that's fitting. Irena never acted for recognition. She acted because the alternative was unthinkable. She acted because Jewish children were dying and she had the means to save some of them. She acted because her father had taught her that you don't look away when people are drowning. Everything else, the fame, the honors, the documentary films and books and plays about her life, all of that came later and mattered less than the simple fact that she had done what needed to be done when it needed doing. The children she saved are dying of old age now. Every year, fewer remain to tell their stories, to remember being sedated and hidden in toolboxes, being led through sewers, being handed to strange Polish families with new names and false histories. Soon they will all be gone, and Irena's story will pass from living memory into history, just names in archives and accounts in books. But the descendants remain. Thousands of people alive today because Irena Sendler refused to accept that children were acceptable casualties of war. Thousands of family trees that branch and bloom because one Polish social worker decided that some things were worth dying for, and then proved brave enough not to die, brave enough to survive torture and preserve the records and live long enough to see at least some of the children reclaim their names and identities. On the wall of Warsaw's Jewish Historical Institute, there's a plaque that reads, Irena Sendler saved 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. 11 words to summarize a life. 11 words to capture years of danger, months of torture, decades of silence. 11 words that can never fully convey what she did, how she did it, or what it cost her. But perhaps that's how the best stories are told. Simply. Directly. Without embellishment. Because the facts themselves are extraordinary enough. A social worker saved 2,500 children from genocide. She kept their names hidden in jars buried in gardens. She endured torture rather than betray them. She lived 98 years and never considered herself a hero. The rest is detail, and the details are preserved in those tissue papers, in the archives, in the memories of the few remaining survivors who can still remember being small enough to fit in a toolbox, young enough to forget their parents' faces, lucky enough to be saved by a woman who believed that every child was worth dying for, and proved it.